Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's FISD Buy-Side Fireside Chat and Roundtable entitled Confessions of a Quant with Avi Rosenbluth. We are going to have a really good time today. It's going to be a little bit of a different format. If I could just ask you to keep your cameras off and keep yourselves muted until we get to the Q&A, that would be fabulous. So I'm just going to go through a few intro slides, and we have an exciting agenda today, so we will get started. So again, welcome. I'm Tracy Shumpert. I am the VP of Membership and Programming here at FISD, and I will be your MC today. Very importantly, I would like to thank our global sponsors, SIBO, FactSet, SIX, and CME Group. I would also like to thank our featured sponsors, S&P Global Market Intelligence, Google Cloud, and Refinitiv. I also want to let you know about our antitrust compliance policy. Like many of your organizations, it's just, we want to abide by the law, so please do not collude. Thank you. Finally, out of respect for our speakers, please treat this event as off the record. However, you can stay connected with us through social media. Many of you have ever increasingly efficient spam filters, and it's hard for us to get our comms through to you, but you can always check on social media to see what we're doing and hopefully join us there. So this is a new thing that we're doing, and I hope you will be able to help. Essentially, in order to fund these events, we have sponsors, as we've discussed, and we need your permission to pass along your contact details to these sponsors so that they can reach out to you if they wish to talk about their products and services. So we would love it if you would give them permission to reach out. And if you would give us permission to pass along those details. If you're willing to do so, could I just ask you to click yes on the consent? If you choose not to, you'll still get to participate, but we would be grateful if you would. So I'll just pause for just a moment to give you a chance to say yes or no. And thank you so much, and we will get back to our program. Can you forward, Michael? Great, thank you. So we are very thrilled to have such a big list of new members. And I'm super excited to point out in particular Bidvor. Elizabeth Pritchard, the CEO, is going to be leading the fireside chat. So welcome to all new members, and hopefully we'll see some of you during the Q&A and catch up. Perfect. Now, I am super excited to introduce to you Richard Goldman, who's the Global Director of Sales and Strategy and Execution of Quant and Feeds at Refinitiv. He is a great speaker and is going to share some thought leadership on avoiding bias in data science. So Richard, if you want to show the world your face, I'll go away, and why don't you lead everybody through your presentation?
All right, let me see if I can handle the face, the camera. It suddenly disappeared. It doesn't show up on the screen anymore.
All right. Well, we'll get to see you for sure at the end, so no stress.
Oh, here it goes. Start my video. Okay.
There we go.
Technology. Well, thank you everybody for joining me, and thank you, Tracy. I'm here to talk about biases. Biases are the things that you're not aware of that are impacting the results, and they affect your ability to understand what's happening, and they impede your ability to predict accurately. Quants and data scientists use a lot of historical financial data in their analysis, whether it's to build machine learning models and train them, or for backtesting to test strategies and understand how they'll work in the real world. Biases are rampant in financial data. The most common biases that I'm going to focus on today are survivorship bias, which is when you ignore companies that have disappeared, they no longer are listed, they no longer exist, and look ahead bias, which is using data that was not known at a particular time in history. It's analogous to investing with a crystal ball. These biases result in inaccurate reflection of historical data. And if you don't address these biases, your machine learning models will be incorrectly trained, and your backtests will overstate achievable results that can be replicated in real life. And again, the purpose of backtest is to have a better understanding when you go live in real markets, how will these strategies perform? And so having a false positive, for example, in a backtest, because you used data that wasn't an accurate reflection, is obviously very painful. A good example of what survivorship bias, our first bias is, and how it can lead to wrong conclusions comes from World War II. The British Navy was trying to understand how they can improve their plane survivability by assessing the planes that came back to base for where they were shot. This is a diagram that summarizes all the planes that came back to base and where they were shot. And from this, they concluded that they wanted to increase their armor in these particular spots. But a data scientist was on the job, and he noticed that there was survivorship bias. He made the assumption that the bullets would be equally distributed throughout the plane during a battle, and that the places where the planes were shot and did not return to base are the most vulnerable places and where the additional armor should go. So here's a clear example where the survivor bias, quite literally in this case, led to the wrong conclusion. And only when you consider the survivorship bias and adjust for it can you come to the right conclusions. There's a lot of survivorship bias in financial data. This is because companies are constantly changing. They're disappearing over time. This could be because of bankruptcies. This could be because of merger activity. Here's one example, AT&T. Many of us remember AT&T, which was the only phone company until 1983, when it was forced by a judge to split up into the 8 baby bells. Subsequently, that one company became 20 some odd different companies that have come and gone over time. And the ability to follow that means that if you're not tracking those historical data, and keeping track of all those historical companies, you're not having an accurate reflection of history. Most people are surprised with how much survivorship bias exists. Here's an example. If we took the Russell 3000 at the end of 1986 and looked at those 3,000 constituents and then tracked them over time, only 565 are trading actively today. You can't ignore those historical companies when you're doing a historical backtest. You need to include those historical companies and all the financial data associated with them if you're going to train a machine learning model to perform in the future in an accurate way. Here's another example. If we today went back in time and said, what are the 1,000 largest companies in Asia about 12 years ago, in the beginning of 2010? Here are the companies. Now, we did this in a point-in-time database. A point-in-time database is one that actually retains all the historical constituents that existed at the time, but also all the data for those companies. It's as if you're looking at a newspaper at every point in time. That's the information that you have as you march through that time series. And you can see here that four of these companies were subsequently delisted after 2010. Some of them were delisted in 2013, 2011, 2017, and 2018. But you need to retain those securities to have an accurate backtest. Look-ahead bias is also common in financial data because companies are constantly restating their results. A typical pattern of how a company reports its results is they usually come out with their preliminary results through a press release. This sometimes occurs 3, 4, 5 weeks after the close of the quarter. After that, they'll release their final numbers through their company reports and regulatory filings. And quite often, subsequent to that, they restate, either through auditing or because they change their accounting practices. Here's a good example. Yum Brands. This is the business that owns all the KFC, Pizza Huts, and Taco Bells around the world. Here's their reported revenues for each year. And what you could see is that for the 2014 results, they reported just over $13 billion of revenue. And they reported that about 5 weeks at the end after the close of the quarter. So the first way that that forward-looking bias can exist is if that 13 billion was time-stamped as the end of the 2014 quarter, December 31st. That would have 5 weeks where any model which was trained off that data would have perfect foresight on what their reported operating revenues would be. Clearly, in the real world, you don't have that foresight. You have to wait, like everybody else, till February 4th of 2015. And then we could see that 2 years later, they revised their numbers significantly. In this particular case, it was because of the way they changed accounting. The problem is you can't use that data point until February 22nd of 2017. If you're using a database that does not have a point-in-time feature of retaining all of the original and any subsequent data points that existed, you'd be using these data points for every year. And using that 6.5 billion of revenue back in 2013 and 14, well, that would be a bias-inducing data point. It would have forward-looking bias where you cannot understand what you really know. Looking back over the last 10 years, from 2010 to 2020, globally, there's been over 1 million restatements made over the last 10 years. So this is a significant problem. It may look like it's declining, but that's only because as time goes on, companies report restatements. And so the most recent year of 2020 of 1,698 will grow as companies do restate their 2020 earnings. And the impact of the survivor bias and forward-looking bias can be quite dramatic. As an example, MathWorks, the company which owns the very powerful software MATLAB, they did some research. And what they did was they created 3 simple models: a value model, a growth model, and a quality model. Very simple models, and they backtested them. They backtested the same model for each of them using both point-in-time data and non-point-in-time data. The non-point-in-time data is in the orange in each of these. And what you could see is they did quite better. The backtest for the non-point-in-time would suggest that these models were quite powerful. Well, in fact, that outperformance that you see over the point-in-time data is unachievable in the real world. That is an overstatement of the model's effectiveness due to the survivorship and the forward-looking biases, creating a situation where the models never had the chance to invest in a bankrupt company because they didn't exist. The models had perfect foresight because the data was overwritten. And so using point-in-time data is the only way to get an effective backtest. It's the only way to get effective machine learning models. And you can see the difference is quite significant. So just in conclusion, biases in financial data is rampant. They happen a lot. I've only focused in on the top 2 causes, but there's other causes as well. And as a result, you don't have an accurate reflection of history. And not having an accurate reflection in history has an implication. By not addressing these biases, you're going to have models which aren't correctly trained to deal with the real world and backtests that overstate results. Thank you very much for your time today.
Richard, thank you so much. That was really interesting. For everyone who's joined, after we get through the fireside chat, we'll be opening up, you have an opportunity to turn your cameras on and ask questions of all the speakers, including Richard. So now I would love to introduce to you Elizabeth Pritchard, who is the CEO of Bitfor, and Avi Rosenbluth, who's a very well-regarded portfolio manager, and they are going to jump in with what I can tell you is going to be a fascinating discussion. So just as a heads up, if you are inspired and would like to ask a question during the fireside chat, Liz and Avi have told me that they're fine with that. Just go ahead and address your question directly to Liz or me so that we can make sure that it gets actually voiced to them. And alternatively, if you want to wait and ask your question directly, you can do that at the end, and everyone will have a chance to sort of talk to each other. So with that, Liz, Avi, thank you so much. I'm going to go away and hand it over to you.
Terrific. Thanks, Tracy. It's great to be here. Richard, loved your talk about bias. Appreciate you sharing that today. We'll invite you back in for the Q&A session. Hey, everybody, good to be here. I'm really psyched that we have Avi Rosenbluth joining us today. Avi and I worked together when we were both at Goldman a little while ago, but it's great to see you here today, Avi. I think it was 12, 14 years, a good run there at Goldman, and then over to AQR, Systematic Hedge Fund. So you certainly have your really impressive career history that we're hoping that you're going to share with us today. And really, you know, what we want to do is really just kind of have this be a really open, transparent session, almost like we're having coffee together. And that's for me and Avi and everybody that is joining in via Zoom. So we really want to, after Avi has a chance to tell us a little bit about his career journey and unpack his views of data and quant land, you know, invite you guys in, and we'd really love to have a collaborative conversation. So I think why don't we kind of set the table, Avi, a little bit for everybody. Take a little bit of time and start in the past and take a look at your career to this point, and you know what led you to a career in quantitative finance, and kind of take us through your journey a little bit.
Sure. And thanks, Liz. Thanks, everybody. I'm very glad to be here. So let's start with the journey, or in a way, how I got to where I am. So in terms of background, I studied, if I go back to university, undergrad in math and physics, I did master's in engineering. And then on top of that, I added an MBA from Wharton. So in terms of the academic background, it's mostly quantitative, but with also a touch of business from the MBA. And then once I graduated from the MBA, I went into Goldman Sachs into a role that is called a strat. Now, it's a bit misleading. It's not strategy, McKinsey style. It's more quantitative strategies. It's more I'd say the analytical army of Goldman Sachs. This is the team that is, pricing derivatives and doing structuring and all kinds of analytical work for the bank. And to be fair, I probably got there more thanks to my math and physics background than thanks to my MBA. And I stayed there for 12 years doing several things. The most dominant of them was structuring, so structured credit. And again, more on the analytical side. And then after that was already in 2016, I moved into AQR. So in a way, moved from the sell side into the buy side. That's a big difference. We'll probably cover that in a minute. And more importantly, AQR is a systematic fund, which means using data, statistics, and analytics in order to make investment decisions. So I spent 5 years with AQR as a portfolio manager, focusing on that. And then Recently, in 2021, I left AQR. I'm now working with two colleagues on a new idea that involves machine learning, again, in the on the side of systematic investing.
Super interesting. So, I mean, you've seen a lot: credit structuring, IBD analytics, systematic hedge fund. So you've really been across this landscape of data usage in a quantitative way, or applying quantitative methods. I mean, when you look back on your career, like what's kind of the evolution of data usage? If you kind of, take the macro view, what in your view has been happening with data through that time?
Yeah, so I think today when we look around, everybody's talking about data and analytics and alternative data and machine learning as if it has always been there. But to be fair, and I'm only going back to 2004, so 17 years, there was very little of that in the world of finance. So it's well known that already in 2004, companies like Amazon were using data and analytics and big data, or at least started using that. The world of finance was not there. The world of finance used financial data, time series, tick data, financial statements, prices, even credit data, benchmarks, and so on. But this is kind of traditional data in the most expected way. Back in 2004, there was hardly anything other than that. Thinking about how to harvest data, how to do machine learning, all those things did not exist at all in 2004. It started growing on people, I would say, in 2008, around the GFC, the great financial crisis. But again, mostly for a very, I'd say, elementary ideas, such as tracking credit. If you have a loan into a company and you need to know who is going to default on you tomorrow, and around 2008, there were crazy things going on a daily basis, all of a sudden, people realized that they actually need databases. The infrastructure wasn't there. Not only the data wasn't there, even if we had the data, it was very hard to query it. The whole thing of using data more cleverly, having the appropriate infrastructure, databases, security around those databases, machine learning, et cetera, started growing more, I would say, in the last 5, 6, 7 years. And again, it's very non-uniform. So if you look at the industry, there are many people think of finance maybe as a more uniform universe. In fact, there are 5, 6, 7, maybe even 8 different beasts there with very different DNAs, and they have been using it in different ways. Some were early adopters, others are still in a way figuring out what they want to do with the data. And financial services, for good reasons, are slow to adapt to this universe.
So is it hype, right? So, when you look at the use of alternative data, is it still, would you say it's pretty early then? I mean, are there some green shoots, or, what do you think kind of across the industry is really happening? And are there kind of pockets where alt data is used more than, other areas?
So the bottom line is those greens are not kind of hesitation.
You know what? You cut out there like on a really key point. Can you just restate that, because you said something really important and I missed it.
Yes, of course. Sure. There is no issue or no problem of motivation. The motivation is really out there. Financial services, all of them, are eager to use data and alternative data for an edge, for some advantage. If you think about the world of investing, it's a very, very, very competitive world. And if you can get another 50 basis points of returns and move up in the returns in the kind of the league tables, anybody will do that, meaning the motivation is definitely there. The industry is slow to adapt to that new world where data is more available for more practical reasons, and in a way, despite a very, very real motivation.
So, all right, let's kind of take a set up the construct. Like, there's a lot of motivation. There's, there's hunt for alpha, hunt for improvement, hunt for speed, right? When you look across the industry, let's kind of set out for the audience kind of what a construct across, you know, say banks and hedge funds, their various uses of data and alternative data, and how it's kind of different in each. So for example, in IBD or investment banking, what would be kind of a classic use case kind of to start off?
So maybe let's try to do it this way. I'll start by stating in a way or explaining what I mean by that universe has very different entities in it, very, you know, a wide range, a gamut of DNAs, and then maybe we can dive into one or two into more specific examples. So if we just look at the world of finance, financial institutions, although it's a single industry, let's start with banks. I'll take Goldman as an example, but most of Wall Street banks are the same. There's investment banking, which is advising on M&As and other things, of course. There's the security division, which is helping with sales, trading, and so on. There is asset management division that is helping private wealth management as well as all kinds of funds. There's equity research, there's operations, there's compliance, and each and every one of them can use data in a very different way. If you think about it, for example, equity research needs data in a very different way from asset management, and also very different way from investment banking. Investment banking, for example, wouldn't buy or sell.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you kind of drill into that a little bit, because I think that'll help clarify
Sure.
for people, you know, the different. It could be the same data, but it's used differently.
Right. So I'll use a few examples. I just want to highlight. So far, we only talked about banks. We didn't even mention the hedge funds, which is yet another group. So if we just take the banks, I'll use as an example investment banking. Investment banking, their business model is to find companies and advise them on things like issuing debt, issuing equity, IPOing or secondaries, mergers, acquisitions, and so on and so forth, many other things. The way you get revenues in such business is advisory. So if you can get the mandate to do an IPO of a company, you will make millions of dollars. If there's a merger and you're advising one of the sites, you can make many millions of dollars. In that sense, you want to have good relationships with the CEO of the company. You want to be the one who can call that guy and say, look, here is something you need to know, and bring a lot of value to that CEO. Relationship is the key. And in that sense, there is a coverage banker who knows the company, who knows the business, who knows the industry. And if you can provide as an alternative data something that would give an insight that the CEO didn't know, and you can call them to say, wow, this is amazing, this kind of relationship over the years would give you eventually the mandate for the deal and the revenues. The good bankers have good relationships, and they are very hungry for an edge in terms of give me something smart to say, okay? And in that sense, alternative data can help them. But they're not buying and they're not selling anything, and the timelines are different. And if you feed them with wrong information, they would look at it and say, this is nonsense, I'm not gonna call anybody. That's one side. Let's talk about asset management. If they get information that's in order to buy and sell, that means that they may have a different universe, a wider universe. And when they get the information, they make a buy or sell decision. If you give them the wrong information and they decide to buy or sell, they can lose millions of dollars based on that. It's a very different nature. Talk about compliance. They want to know if there's, let's say, some SEC issue with the company. They don't really care about the industry and the business. They care about the company. So each and every one of them is very, very different, okay? All that is only in the side of banking. Let's move to the buy side. Buy side, you have hedge funds. Some of them are discretionary. Some of them are systematic. Again, very different. Discretionary, when you provide alternative data, someone reads it and can analyze and combine it with other things. Systematic, it's usually a universe of hundreds and maybe thousands of companies. No one is going to be able to read this entire information end to end, all fields every day, and figure out if there's a mistake. So the fact that the universe is wider means something. The fact that no one can read all the information and curate it is important. Very different DNA, very different constraints, very different considerations when it comes to the alternative data. So if you want to just think simplistically about investment banking division coverage banker, as compared to a portfolio manager in a systematic fund, the way they think about data, alternative data in this entire universe has very little in common. It has some things in common, but not much.
I love how
And
you
by the way,
describe it, right?
I haven't even
From a
mentioned the
commercial
venture capital, the private equity.
Right.
There is more.
The thing is like finance, right? The financial industry, what the way you're laying it out and describing it, right? It is balkanized, right? It's not the same. And and I love how you laid out the use cases. You really, I'm thinking through the lens of, say, a data vendor. Okay. Some of who are on this call, when they think about finance, it sounds like one of the keys that you're laying out is like, you really have to think about the commercial objective for the use case, that banker and that coverage banker and what they're trying to do, that asset manager who's managing a portfolio, what are they trying to do? The compliance officer, what are the decisions they're trying to make? And target based on the commercial value of the data. So that's, finance is not finance, right? It's very bespoke use cases, group by group. But let's go a bit more micro, if you don't mind, just to kind of delve a little deeper into your world, and maybe you could take us into, really drill in what it's like to be in your shoes, okay, as a quant. And maybe you can take us into kind of the day of a life of a systematic portfolio construction quant.
Sure, and one thing you said, I'm gonna answer that in 5 seconds. You said finance is not uniform. Even a hedge fund is not a uniform hedge fund. Even within the world of hedge funds, there's a very wide range, and that's important to keep in mind. So understanding the client. You mentioned compliance. We probably have to talk about that. Maybe a day in the life office is a good way to do that. So
Sure.
Most recently, I was with AQR. I'll take a day in the life of a portfolio manager in a systematic fund, okay? So the key is that I have to trade every day, simply because of volume and market impact. I want to trade every day. And I have a production line, a production process that has a very strict timeline, because a lot of it is systematic. I have to wake up in the morning, I have to read a signal that says, here is where we want to be. And that's coming out of our models. Then I have to run an optimizer. Then I have to figure out what happens to capacity. Did my optimizer ask me to do things that I cannot do in terms of market capacity? I can't buy $10 billion, of a small cap stock in a single day. Then I have to figure out how to allocate the capacity that I do find to all the little funds. Then I have to manage flows, some of them arriving late in the day. Then I have to get ready to send out the trades, monitor, figure out that my holdings would end up in a position where I want them to be. All that is reviewed not only by portfolio managers, but also by compliance. The whole thing has to go to trading, to start trading. And keep in mind that the timeline is also complicated because of time differences. Australia opens 5:30 p.m. the day before here. So if I want to trade in Australia, especially if I have large trades, I cannot send the trades much later because I'm starting to lose capacity during that day. So I have a strict timeline. I start at a certain point and the machine has to go. Why am I mentioning all this? If you provide alternative data that comes into my signal, and that alternative data has to be there at 10, but one day you send it at 11 and therefore you delay my production machine, okay? I really don't like you. And if you do it more than a couple of times, you're out, because if because of you, I couldn't run my machine, therefore I couldn't send my trades and I missed a full day of trading because of that. And usually, by the way, with bad luck, that would overlap with like a market event somewhere or some regulatory snafu, or a major, I don't know, North Korea launching a rocket over Japan. That would be a major event for me. It may be even a regulatory event. So because I'm systematic and I have this very strict timeline, I have this optimizer that I have to run, I have this machine that has a lot of dependencies in the back, it is critical to have all the data available, correct, curated, on time for that machine. I'll just mention here, again, the context of compliance. Compliance checks that my process is safe. I may get a fine, and when I say a fine in finance, it's in the millions, for having a machine that is not safe enough, even if I don't have an incident. So if, for example, I get external data, I don't curate it, even if that data never caused a mistake, but could cause a mistake and my process is not safe enough, the regulator can fine me.
So
And
that's really interesting. And because I think people can think of hedge funds as not really regulated, and it can be kind of the wild, wild west, which is not really true, right? So can you just kind of draw out that point a little bit more about the regulatory construct and how much that really impacts what you're doing?
Sure. And I'll mention that complexity of the production machine is just one. There's probably another one that is worth mentioning, but we'll get to it. The regulators in finance are very worried about the quality of handling other people's money. So there are many rules. There are many limitations in terms of what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. There are many requirements in terms of reporting. So if I have, for example, a trading error or something going wrong with my process, there's some threshold to that, which is pretty low, but I'm required to report it. So if I get wrong data, in the sense that just as an example, decimal point is off, or units are screwed up, or something along those lines, if I get wrong data and trade on it, even if I ended up making money for the client because the mistake, I was lucky with it, I still have to report it as a regulatory event. So keeping the process safe is in many cases more important than keeping the process best. And there are many decisions that are made with the consideration, yes, it looks a little bit better, but it is also more risky. The regulator does not want me to do that, and I'm not going to do that. And even if I do it, I will regret it. The regulation in finance, and you can read about it in the newspaper, like the letter, the spirit, and the practical events are very, very strict. Companies that are going out of the way to comply with absolutely everything pay fines from time to time.
Really interesting.
At least let me just go back. I spoke in length about the day in the life of, I'll say one more.
I want to mine around that a little bit more about, in the prep session, we were talking about in a non-linear world, wrong data can have unpredictable consequences. So if you could talk about that a little bit as well.
So the other thing is, if you give me alternative data and I want to incorporate it into my signal, again, in a systematic world, which is what we're focusing on now, I have to run it through backtests. Now, some of the alternative data is relatively new. Twitter, if you take just an example, the sentiment on Twitter, we may have 10 years of that, but I mean, in terms of popularity, maybe even less than that. In the world of systematic finance, the last 10 years have all been bull market, the market has been going up. If I can test it in my backtest, going back more than one cycle, it's very hard for me to trust. A lot of the things we test go back 25, sometimes, I'm not kidding, 100 years. Now, if you come back and say I have perfect information from the last 4 years, I have not seen any downturn with this information, and that's a problem. It is more a problem.
Yeah, you cut out there. You cut out there.
Yeah,
you cut out there on the data for the last 4 years.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit more?
If I only have 4 years of data, and during the last 4 years, the market has been a bull market, we haven't seen a crisis like 2000, 2001, or like 2007, 2008 in the last 4 years. I have no idea how this performs in a bear market. I haven't seen it. We usually look at 25 years as a minimum and sometimes 100 years to the extent we can. So I know alternative data only has, in some cases, 4 or 10 years, and that is all I have, but that would make people very careful about using it. Now, I'm not blaming anybody. I'm saying in terms of reality, I would like to get as much history as I can. Generally, by the way, in finance, think about machine learning. If you want to recognize a face, or if you want to drive a car, it doesn't have history. I can learn how to drive a car today, and if I take a video from a year ago, it would be the same. When it comes to finance, the time series element is very different. So when you talk about machine learning in finance is very different from machine learning for most other purposes, right? And that kind of, so, and all that, now I'll add one more element, the nonlinear element. If I get data that is not perfectly curated, okay, in terms of face recognition, I may not recognize the face. But in finance, where if I put it into a neural network, where it's a bit of a black box, and I get data that is just off by 10%, it could be the equivalent of unleashing the nuclear bomb in the sense of the nonlinear effects that that such a mistake can have. So the whole industry is very, very careful about being safe, understanding exactly what the data is, making sure it's correct, back testing it for as long as possible. And that means that good alternative data has many restrictions when it comes to our industry.
I have two follow-on questions, and one is an audience question. One question is around back testing. Now, are you in your day in the life, are you back testing every day?
We're not back testing every day. We are back testing when we modify the signal. And keep in mind, if you test over 25 years and sometimes more, even if I have another 1 year of data that is not very consistent, it shouldn't change the signal all the time. So when I test, I'm testing as much as I can. I sometimes recalibrate, again, not daily, but more frequently. But we definitely don't backtest every day. Backtesting is a very long and painful process. We cannot do it every day.
Right. What about, you were talking about some of the implications of, bad data coming in. And, that certainly goes to, there's quite a bit of data in the advertising realm, data that's used for advertising. And some of those vendors will then want to come to finance and, not fully understanding the implications, right, of data quality. If you're showing the wrong ad, so what, move on. But if, to your point, if the data in a nonlinear world is incorrect, it could be significant losses. So the ramifications of poor quality data is significant in finance. And to tack on to that, we have an audience question with respect to, well, what if you've got data piped in from a source and the source dries up? It either dries up, you may know in advance, you may have a little bit of advance warning, but it could be your source's or origin data, is a surprise and you don't see it when at the start of day. Have you encountered situations like that, or could you kind of comment on the impact of that situation?
I'll start with the second one. Okay, this is kind of a mechanical question. Look, we maintain the models every day, all day. We have actually all systematic funds have an army of really capable people maintaining the model. So signals come, signals go, signals change, and then all kinds of restrictions show up. And unexpectedly, regulation changes. I'll give you just a quick example. Back in March of 2020, when COVID hit, some regulators in Europe showed up and said, you're not allowed to introduce new short positions, and we're doing look-through to derivatives. Meaning, if you have a short, in a single name and a long in the derivative, and you sell the derivative, look at the portion of that derivative that applies to that single name, and we count it it's counted as a new short. Some kind of a crazy rule that we never had before. And then literally overnight, we had to adjust the models for that. So if a data source goes away, we know how to handle it. If we have information that one day, sometimes databases are down, we know how to handle those situations. We have to report them to the regulators sometimes. But there are ways to handle all those. What is, and people would understand that. What people wouldn't accept is adding operational risk that is not necessary. So for example, if you have an alternative data and you give it to me every day by 10 a.m. and then just once a month it slips, so I have one missing day or it arrives late and so on, That's unacceptable. And by the way, imagine that I have 30 alternative data sources and each and every one of them chooses a different day of the month, and then I'm constantly fighting fires. So in that sense, especially if you know in advance, we maintain the model anyway. If data goes away, that's fine. If data shows up, it's fine, etc. As long as we can use it without interrupting our machine too much. I'll go back to your first question, the impact of a mistake or a data issue. So look, in non-finance, there are sometimes it's not severe and sometimes it's severe. If you push the wrong coupon to the person, the wrong ad and so on, it's not a big deal. But sometimes if you try to drive a car and you don't identify the wall against you, and people die, and that actually happened. Like the Tesla, killed a few people here and there because the algorithm wasn't perfect. I'm not going to say that in finance and critical, in other places it's not. Even in finance, there are places where it's less critical. Think about the coverage banker that we talked about in investment banking. You give them the wrong information, they should know the industry, look at it and say, this is nonsense, improve your algorithm. But if you go into systematic fund, if you go into machine learning, right, that's the point where you can, just as an example, Richard earlier today talked about corporate actions. Let's say there's a split. The share price fell in half. My reference data, my metadata doesn't capture it. Often I'm saying, oh my God, this stock is so cheap, and I'm going and I'm buying millions of it, and as a result, I'm losing millions of dollars, right? That is a regulatory event that I need to compensate my clients. I mean, in a world where I can go and say, let's buy $1 billion worth of Apple, and I do it because my metadata is inaccurate, the consequences are expensive. I'm not saying anybody would die, but they are expensive. So think of it as, in the real world, sometimes it's benign, sometimes it's severe. In finance, sometimes it can be benign, especially if a person looks at it. Sometimes it can be severe. And the severe is intensified by the regulatory supervision, which is very, very strict.
So, we have a good understanding, right, of in finance, right, of the things that can happen that are, definitely in the risk framework we want to avoid. Okay, let's turn that around now to, okay, requirements. So when we're thinking about, okay, what does that mean then in terms of the perfect data set? What are the characteristics of a perfect data set? And some of what you've been talking about in terms of quality, in terms of making sure it's there when you need it, kind of those operational characteristics, if you can elucidate on those and kind of draw those out a little bit more as well, that would be really helpful. So kind of the content, the design of the content requirements, and then the operational characteristics as well.
Yeah, so it's right. Those are both super important. The data itself, is it comprehensive enough, accurate enough, timely enough, as well as the operational aspects of it. Those are super important. And all I can say, when you try to sell to someone, start by understanding really, really well all their considerations, because you may have fantastic data that doesn't work for some reason that is a bit obscured in the sense of those aspects that I'm going to mention. So if I think about a list, I'd say you want to have the full relevant universe. If you do a systematic fund that invests, for example, in Russell 3000, and you only have, I don't know, website visits for 2,500, that signal is incomplete. You want to have a comprehensive, covering the full universe that the fund cares about, especially if it's systematic, definitely if it's machine learning, right? You want to have a complete time series, no gaps. You want to go, it has to be frequent enough. It has to be sufficient history. So think about the time series. Driving a car, it's not important to have a time series. When it comes to investing, you must have the full time series going as far back as possible, simply for backtest. You want to have sufficient metadata and accurate metadata. Again, think about, I'll use that example that I think everybody knows is not very useful. Taking satellite photos of parking lots of shopping malls, right? If that time series is complete, but you don't have the metadata that they had a fire drill one day, or they had a car accident, or for some other reason, that shopping mall was closed for a day, your time series may be screwed up in the sense that it shows a relatively empty day for reasons that are unrelated to the business. And in that sense, your machine learning or your statistical model can learn the wrong things. So you want to have sufficient and accurate metadata to allow the statistics to do an appropriate job. You want it to be consistent, uniform, joinable. If, for example, your data is related to a company, you want to make sure that the tickers are correct. Richard talked about corporate actions. If you don't capture those corporate actions and you have a ticker on a certain data, that ticker no longer exist because of some kind of a spin-off or a take private or something like that. Again, the data wouldn't join well. And from the operational point of view, I mentioned it has to be reliable, timely, curated. You want to have the audit trail so you can, when the regulator shows up and says what happened here, you want to know what data you had at the time you ran your optimizer, et cetera, et cetera. So I think all those are examples of a world where you have to have sufficient data that captures all the relevant information, especially the metadata, as well as operational safety that is in line with the expectations of your client.
So when you think about these requirements, right, which are very real for systematics, and also maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room, like there's a little bit of lessening of those specific requirements for the fundamental world. Taking a step back then, right? So we went very micro. Let's take a step back a little bit. In practice then, what do you think is really happening with alternative data and its usefulness across the industry?
I believe everybody is super motivated to use alternative data. Edge is really important. The world of finance is super competitive. There are league tables. Sometimes 50 basis points can make a difference between a fund that is thriving and a fund that is essentially shut down. The motivation is there. In the world of discretionary, it's easier, and in that sense, it's penetrating better. In the world of systematic, because of all the things we talked about in the last 10, 15 minutes, it's still exploratory. The world of systematic is still relying much more heavily on traditional data, prices, credit ratings, etc., tick data, stuff like that. And adding alternative data is something that everybody wants to do and is thinking about. I think if we take it one step further to machine learning, all the systematic funds have machine learning efforts, which is relatively small and exploratory. I'm not aware of many funds that offer machine learning based management. Now, if you think about that, would be the holy grail, because then you turn on the computer invests and you make money, and the computer is supposed to be smarter than anybody. It's the best
kind of like the factory run by robots, right? And then you turn the lights off and everybody goes home. You know, it is the best. Yeah, that's not really the reality, right?
It's the best chess player for more than 20 years. And we still don't make any investments based on just machine. And it's exactly that messy element of dealing with time series, dealing with events. Like, the emperor of Japan decided to abdicate a year ago, and then we had 10 days without trading in Japan. Machine learning doesn't know how to handle those one-off events. And the alternative data, if you, just as an example, capture something that's going on in Japan, that would be a one-off event that we're still not there. But the bottom line is, everybody wants it. It's making its way. Discretionary finds it easier. Systematic, you guys have to find a way to make it safe and compatible enough for the systematic funds to use it.
And along that same line then, okay, we know the requirements are tough, right, in systematic. When you look at the construct of the systematic hedge fund, within the fund, what are some of the biggest challenges that you face working with data? What's the view of senior management? What about investment in data infrastructure, things like that? If you could comment on that, any specific external challenges that you face?
I think I'll focus my answer on the word you mentioned, which is management. From my experience, management understands the importance and the need, but they don't fully trust the solutions yet. I found it to be an uphill battle time and again to convince the most senior people that it's a good investment. And I think the spirit is, for the last 10 years, I keep hearing about this great new solution. I invest a year and a lot of money in it, only to hear a year later, yes, we haven't achieved anything yet, but then now there's this new great technology that can help further. And then yet another great solution a year later. This is a very expensive process, the modernization of the infrastructure. Those are things that even the largest institutions struggle with. If you take a bank like Goldman, probably for the last 10 years, data is central, and still you would be shocked with how much of the bank's operation is still running in Excel spreadsheets. Databases is kind of a modernized infrastructure, is still not there. And by the way, one thing you could say, hey, now there's the cloud, everything is cheap. Again, because of regulatory constraints, financial institutions hesitate to go into the cloud, because you move into the cloud and then the cloud is down, and as a result, you couldn't invest. The regulator would blame you for doing that. Why didn't you keep an in-house backup? You have client money. So I would say management is hesitant to make the investment. The modernization is expensive. And even though we have good solutions today, there are companies trying to come up with solutions. Refinitiv, they have something called QA, quantitative analytics, I believe, platform. Amazon just launched a FinSpace to help with this, I would say, IT effort to simplify it and to make it cheaper. But still, it is expensive, and management is hesitant because in the past, it has been a decade of putting money into it and seeing slow progress.
Yeah, I mean, it's key, right? When leadership has to be convinced to make the investments. We've got that challenge, and then we have the challenge of the regulatory environment, which is, well, I say it's a challenge, but it's also a guardrail, right? To make sure that the data is used appropriately, the quality of data that is feeding the models is correct. And, and it kind of keeps those guardrails in place to kind of ensure the industry is interoperating at its best, or let's say highest level of optimization, considering the regulatory construct. Super interesting. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm mindful that we're just about at the top of the hour when we want to open up Q&A. Why don't you just take a few minutes and kind of, summarize, what do you think some of the key takeaways are that you'd like to get across to the community that's joined today? Some key takeaways.
Sounds good. And I think it's relatively simple and quick. Systematic, machine learning based, automated, and in that sense, cheaper to operate machine is the holy grail for everybody. Everybody wants it. The industry is as motivated as you can imagine to use data and alternative data in a clever way. But there are practical considerations in terms of the safety of the data, safety of using it, the completeness of the data, the regulatory requirements, and so on and so forth. So it's making its way first into the more discretionary world, bankers targeting CEOs or discretionary funds making decisions, simply because there's a person in the loop who can look through the data and trust it. But the systematic funds, all of them are more hesitant, but only for practical reasons. They would be thrilled to use the data to give them an edge. And if you think about it, they are even better prepared to take, large amounts of data and many different data sets in order to use. It's only about the practical considerations. So the message to you in a way is try to really understand your clients, not only in terms of how they make their money, but more, what are they afraid of? What are their timelines? How often do they run the machine? What their alpha decay is? Try to find a way to do a few things for them. One of them is to convince them, to make them comfortable that you will not be the ones slowing down their machine. The other one is help them with the testing, with the look back, with the back testing for long enough, and so on. Help them a lot with the onboarding. the infrastructure is not where you imagine it is. Some of them cannot go to the cloud for regulatory reasons. Some of them are afraid to go to the cloud. Look into those platforms that are trying to help with that. What Richard mentioned earlier about handling corporate actions, that is key. If you can't handle corporate actions, it's very hard to use your data in terms of investing. So in a way, understand those pain points, and you have to understand that those constraints are not because people are spoiled. It's because if they make a mistake, it is so expensive that they can't afford to make most of those mistakes.
That's really a great message to really emphasize, which is, and it kind of brings us full circle in our conversation, which is that the data is, there's an economic user at the end of the data, right? Kind of front to back, the data comes in, and then there's an economic user. That may be a systematic algorithm. It may be a banker. It may be a compliance officer. But you really need to understand as a data vendor, really needs to understand what is that commercial value, what is that economic use case.
I'll say it this way. There was a point in time that I managed a large fund that dealt with MSCI emerging, those are emerging markets. I had to invest in small cap companies in Pakistan, okay? Think about how much alternative data you have about this. And until you have data about that, any data set you bring, even if it covers any other emerging country, it's incomplete. I'm not saying it's impossible to do something with it, but it's a challenge. So small cap in Pakistan, that's part of the universe.
Yeah. All right. Listen, this has been fantastic. We've covered a lot of ground. You've been so generous with your time and your experience and your views. And I'm going to hand it over to Tracy. We're going to open up the Q&A, and we've got some good questions coming in.
Thank you, Liz. My pleasure.
Avi, Elizabeth, thank you. That was fascinating. Liz, I actually just sent you an anonymous question that came through to me, so I want to make sure you see that.
Sure.
Everyone who is on the call, we invite you to turn on your cameras and unmute yourself if you like, and we're now going to treat this like a little bit of a Zoom meeting. So if you are comfortable, we'd be delighted if you would just shout out your questions to Liz and Avi or Richard. Liz, Avi, Richard ask questions of each other. We're gonna have a bit of a free-for-all. So we'll see how this goes. We may end up breaking out into smaller groups for a smaller group discussion if we have time, but let's go for it. So everyone, please ask your questions. Thank you.
Hey, maybe I'll start with a couple of questions that have come in that we didn't get a chance to get to, just to kind of get the ball rolling, if that's okay with everybody. One question is, Avi, what have quants learned from the market crash last year?
It's an interesting question. And surprisingly, I think the answer is not much in the sense that while it was a bit shocking to everybody, quants tend to look at the world further back. So, for example, for us, a lot of things we do, we calibrate to 1987, where the market dropped about 20%, like, more than 20 standard deviations in one day. So in that sense, can the market go down by 10%? Absolutely. Not only we know it, we experienced it. So what happened in 2020 is the market dropped by roughly 35%. That's not too much. We've seen worse. Volatility went through the roof. There were markets that went down 10%, up 10%, down 10%, up 10% for, I think, more than a week in a row. So volatility was through the roof. And as a result, we had to respond. And as a result, the regulators had to respond and added all kinds of rules that we haven't seen before. None of that shocked us. The finance is a world of black swans. Like once a week, there's a military coup somewhere, or there's like rockets fired, or a Brexit, or something along those lines. What we did is we tested again the flexibility of our machines. And here and there were fire drills, but I don't think that was a shock. What you could say, quant funds could have, because the performance was terrible, quant funds could have concluded that, oh my God, there are times where the quant models don't work. We also know that. So 2020 was not a good year, but 2019 was also a terrible year without COVID. So it's unfortunate to have two of those in a row. But in terms of like, oh my God, who would have imagined? There wasn't that much of that.
Okay, great answer. And it sounds like, volatility is the norm and you need to be resilient. All right, so thank you for that. We have a question that's come in for systematic firms.
Yep.
Do you use data or information outside of the machine for things, so not incorporated, wired up to the machine, for things such as screening or for building an investment universe, et cetera? A specific example would be like ESG data.
So the answer is yes, but it's kind of yes. Yes, the answer is yes. It's not a clear no. We do use it from time to time, but we don't like it. Kind of, you do it when you have to, and it's frowned upon. Because take ESG data, for example. We could go and say, hey, let's use ESG data outside the machine, but that's not our DNA. Our clients would look at it and say, wait a minute, did you turn into a discretionary fund? We don't like that. So some funds use ESG data inside the machine. For example, you can take the ESG score that is published by certain entities. You can enrich it. You can even generate your own ESG schedule or score, and then add it to your optimizer either as a constraint or as an input that would kind of nudge your investments away from bad ESG, right? But to the extent possible, you would put it in the machine. There are things that cannot be put into the machine, and I'll use Brexit as an example. If you have an event like Brexit coming up, right? It's a one-off, there's no way to prepare, there's going to be a shock to the system. And that's the point, that there's really no way to put it into the machine. And then there are alternatives. One of them would be to say, I know Brexit is coming. I know my machine would know how to handle it. Let me scale down my exposure to this event. You can choose UK or Europe or maybe the entire world. I mean, depending on what you want to do. By telling the machine, I have a big uncertainty coming, let me scale things down so that if there is a shock, I'm not as impacted. So I would say you do, but not happily. You try to put all the data into the machine, and when you cannot, you still try not to be fully discretionary. You basically tell the machine to calm down rather than tell the machine, you think you want to sell Japan, I actually think you should buy. Again, I don't want to speak on behalf of everybody, but generally speaking, I think a quantitative mindset is, I'm not discretionary, it means I'm not discretionary.
Mm-hmm. And how about the audience? Richard or the audience, anybody else want to hop in on that question or tee up a new one?
Well, we do see quants adjusting when they see paradigm shifts, as Avi said, which they think that their models have been trained for an environment that's not going to be, and I think Brexit was a great example. We're seeing a lot of quants starting to utilize ESG content. Historically, it's been tough because it doesn't have a high frequency. It tends to be once a year, companies will report. But increasingly, we're seeing ESG data sourced from media, looking at all the news sources and social media that's out there, that there are a few thousand social media sites that are committed to discussions on things like in the environment and corporate governance and anti-slavery and gun control. And you can derive a lot of good ESG type of scores from there. Higher frequency than the traditional ESG data.
And I think what I'm
very interesting
saying, if someone provides alternative data based on that and generates a signal, I think the quants would prefer to put it into the machine rather than override the machine.
Absolutely, especially when it's orthogonal. When it's data that is not highly correlated to their current data sources, then it really has an impact, a diversifying impact. It allows these factor models to be improved because you're triangulating a new data source and a new approach to them.
That's oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, Liz, just something that a really interesting piece of information I remember we talked about in one of the prep calls that I just wanted to give Avi and Richard a chance to address if they wanted. So I assume, not being an alternative data provider myself, but that there's a lot of investment that goes into developing a data set that so that eventually you can sell it to, someone like you, Avi. Do you have any recommendations for the vendors on the call about when it makes sense to invest in, all the time and energy it takes to develop a product, and when maybe it's just not worth it?
It would be hard for me to come up with a kind of a formula for that, but I would say try to figure out what, in a perfect world, what that signal would be. How much, which universe would it cover? How frequently can you get this information? How timely can you get this information? Okay. How reliably can you get this information? Is it easy to curate, and so on and so forth? And once you have that, try to figure out who would be willing to buy it. So if you end up generating information about 90% of the companies in a certain universe, and it turns out that your clients wouldn't buy it unless you have 100%, it's probably a bad idea, right? And I've seen those. People came and pitched, web traffic, but for a limited universe. There may be discretionary funds that would be happy to use it. There may be systematic funds that would be happy to use it if the universe is narrow enough. But maybe test with them, if we were to provide something along those lines, would there be a client? Because I think the DNA of those different funds is very different. And it is possible that you have something that is fantastic, but incomplete for a reason that you can't predict upfront. And as a result, it wouldn't have much audience. Maybe it is even possible to develop that as a joint venture. Find a partner, tell them what you have in mind, get feedback from them, give them the information for free for a year, but as you develop it, work with them so that you can fine tune, so that you create something that is pluggable into the existing machines.
We do have a related question here from the audience. I'll just pop in with, appreciate your comments on. It's around the trustworthiness of data sources. And it has to do with, what is your feeling on the quality of data directly sold from financial markets versus the data sold by a third party, such as a data company? Do you think there is one that is more reliable or trustworthy than the other? And I could actually ask the person who asked the question to weigh in on this to make sure we fully understand it. It sounds like it's a question about sold from financial markets. Do you mean sold from a data vendor? So if the person who asked the question wants to chime in on that. It has to do with the sources of data, and is there more trustworthiness in who you buy from, maybe established data vendors versus non-established data vendors?
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Simone Pellegrini. I'm working for Borsa Italiana, so in the Italian market. So I'm a little bit a foreigner in this field. So sorry if my question is not super clear because I don't do data vending. But my question is like, is there any sense of, I don't know, in my mind, sometimes I think maybe there is some sort of difference between the data that is bought directly from the source instead of data that is bought by any third party that of course has the advantage of collecting all the data source, for example, all the market data, and you just buy it once. But maybe, I don't know, is there somehow a feeling that it's not like the actual original data? I'm not really sure if the question is more easy to understand right now, but I just wanted to investigate whether there's any feeling, or maybe not. Maybe it's just really the simple and most effective method. I choose it and that's it.
Richard, I can take that.
Why don't you start, Avi? I have some thoughts as well. Please, go ahead. So
at least from the industry's point of view, you're dealing with, any fund is dealing with so much data, so many providers, and so many data points, and such a high, I'd say, frequency, that the question is not, can you avoid mistakes? You have mistakes, data errors all the time. There's no doubt about it. You have entire teams in IT dedicated to ingesting the data, curating the data, monitoring the data, raising flags, and so on. And your data vendors can't avoid, because of the complexity of the world. Sometimes, the exchange in Hong Kong had a computer glitch and had to shut down in the middle of the day. And God knows when the data is available for that half day, which is, and so on and so forth. So the question is not, do you have mistakes? You have mistakes all the time. The point is that you have to show that you were careful enough and safe enough. In other words, you need to buy from someone who's trustworthy, and to some extent standard de facto in the industry. So if I need to, for example, I have benchmark data, I want to buy it from MSCI because they sell to absolutely everybody. And if MSCI has a mistake, the regulator cannot show up and say, why did you buy from MSCI? What's wrong with you? Because I've been buying from them for years, and they are serious, and they have the reputation, and they're kind of as good as it gets. And something happened. I even have my process of finding this mistake, and et cetera, et cetera. And the regulator would look at it and say that that's reasonable. You're not punished for a mistake that happened, you're punished for the negligence. So the important thing is to be able to show that the standard of care was sufficiently high. When you show up to sell third-party data, you want to be able to prove that you have enough people, machines, processes, whatever it is, doing a sufficiently serious effort to avoid mistakes, so that when they happen, and they happen, right, it wasn't because nobody cares.
Another angle of this is we're seeing a lot of companies getting into the data business as a sort of an exhaust of their primary business. You see phone companies selling anonymized data about cellular usage and where there are cellular phones walking around to see foot traffic, or there's a lot of this exhaust data. Companies on the web who are selling usage of their websites and things like that. I think the challenge there is to understand how these companies, they're not primarily data vendors, how do they address what Avi's talking about, that the process to ensure that the data that they're tagging to a specific company is actually that company. I mean, if you're following foot traffic using cell phone GPS and seeing how many people walk by a street corner, how do you know that that's a Gap store and it's a tag to the right company? And how clean is the history? We've looked at a lot of alternative data sources, and most of them fail in how they create the history. It's not an accurate reflection. They backfilled, and once you start doing some rigorous testing on it, it doesn't hold up. And I think understanding the provenance of the data. Most of the big data vendors, ourselves and our competitors, have teams and teams of quality and data collectors and scrubs and algorithms to find out outliers and stuff. So I don't think it's a matter of a data collector or a primary source. It's understanding is it their primary business? And if not, how are they approaching that to make sure that it's rigorous? And fail-safe, as Avi said, the risk that you don't get that data one day, you can't trade, that's painful.
That's more than painful. But
so we're talking about, the obviously important requirements from both a content and operational perspective to fuel that data right into financial institutions. Let's talk and how that is getting more rigorous over time. Let's kind of shift to the lens of the buy side firms, and folks on the call, please jump in if you have questions. One I would tee up is what have been the changes and the demands on technology and also market data, the classic data sourcing, classic market data teams. It seems to me that compared to Avi 2004, right, to today, it almost seems like, and this is a bit of a leading question, but it almost seems like the capabilities of the person in that seat. There's much more, there's a higher bar, or there's a new set of capabilities that have to be developed for the roles in IT and the roles in market data sourcing teams.
The way I think of it, in finance, hardly ever you have big data problems. Simply, finance is not the world of big data. I'll say it again. Finance is not the world of big data. Instead of a big data problem, we have many, many, many small data problems. But if you think about a world where the major indices are 1,500 companies, and for each and every one of them, they report quarterly. And then you can add on top of that all kinds of like the closing price of every day, unless you go into tick data from the exchanges, meaning that every tick that changes, milliseconds apart, it's never a big data problem. So the technological aspect, especially today with the cloud, is ridiculously cheap. You can run a machine learning fund probably by paying Amazon $200 a month in terms of the cost of computing and the cost of storage. It's not big data. Even the computing in most cases is not that sophisticated. So the role of IT, now not everybody can go to the cloud, but the role of IT in terms of maintaining the databases and so on, that is not necessarily the major issue. And I find it hard to believe that you would show up with an alternative data and someone say, storage is too expensive for me. That is really no longer the case in any way, shape, or form. IT is super important, critical in terms of maintaining this machine. So I deployed something in production, it has a bug, I run the machine, the optimizer gets stuck, and instead of running a millisecond, it runs 5 seconds. And now I have to run that on 10,000 different, micro optimizations, and all of a sudden my machine is stuck. I need to reset my machine, find the bug, fix it, and rerun my machine, and I'm behind schedule. That's the point where I really want my IT to be in place. So when it comes to vendors of alternative data, IT is usually not the hurdle. You're hardly, when it comes to finance, hardly ever large or big data, and hardly ever sophisticated or too demanding in terms of the computation. So again, IT is absolutely critical because the machine is automated. But the bottleneck wouldn't be large data sets. Again, this is in most cases. There are exceptions, but there are rare.
Trading is another story. Trading is another story, right? Market data, price data, like you said, tick data.
Tick data, yes.
Yes.
And those are, by the way, usually hold as flat files, not in relational databases.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Richard, and anybody in the audience?
Well, we're seeing a broader acceptance of the cloud. 10, 15 years ago, all of our clients insisted on deployed servers in their own offices with their teams of data science, their IT people and their air-conditioned, racks. The cloud has become accepted as something that's reliable. They're built in, they are built in. A lot of times clients expect that they'll have 2 different cloud environments, one in the US, one in Europe or in Asia, so that if one goes down, there's a backup. There has to be that type of fail-safe. And so the attitude towards that has shifted dramatically because of the storage and the ability to turn on computational power. If you have some really intensive processing to do, you could turn it on for a select period and crunch through it quickly and then turn it off, as opposed to having to have all the CPU on site.
I agree with Richard. And as you said, it's a process. It's still happening. As of 3 years ago, there are more hesitations today, fewer and fewer, but it still is under construction. It still is something that will take a few more years.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anybody, we're just coming to the close of the session. Do we have one final question from the audience?
While they're thinking, I'll just say when I put this together, I'd forgotten that it was likely that the audience would be as secretive many as potentially our speakers. We're lucky we got you, Avi, when we did. So let's see, maybe one victim, Stephen. Perhaps. Stephen Reiser, did you have a question? No, he's disappeared.
Okay.
We can't hear you, Stephen. You're on mute.
Actually, I don't have a question, but I was going to say, in my decades in this industry, this could be the best FISD webinar I've ever attended.
Woohoo!
Round of applause for
Thank you,
Avi
guys.
and
Thank you.
Richard.
Excellent job, Avi.
Thank you.
Great job, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let's close on that incredibly high
Exactly.
note.
We
Thank
can't do
you.
better than that.
Thank
Thank
So much. Really.
Thank you
terrific,
very
guys.
much for having me.
Thank you both, everybody. We're delighted. Let's just, Michael, let's just throw up our closing slides to be able to lead everybody out. So again, thank you, Avi. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Richard. That was fantastic. We skipped that. Let's skip that too. If you enjoyed this, we have much more coming up. In June, a whole roster of events, and very importantly, on June 17th, we will be announcing the dates and locations for WIFIC. So if you want to come join us and find out what's going to be happening and do a little WIFIC reminiscing, please do on the 17th. Fill out your post-event survey. We hope you liked it, but if you'd like to give us any feedback or give us any ideas about future events, we would really appreciate that. And finally, again, thank you so much to our global sponsors, SIBO, FactSet, SIX, and CME Group. And to our sponsors, Google Cloud, S&P Global Market Intelligence, and Refinitiv. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and I hope to see you at an FISD event online or perhaps even in person. Stay tuned and very soon. Take care, everybody, and have a great day.